In the autumn of 2012, Mark and Lisa were enjoying a weekend getaway in a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. They had rented the cabin to escape their busy city lives and enjoy some peace and quiet. The cabin was situated miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest. One evening, as they were preparing dinner, they heard a knocking sound at the cabin door. Mark went to answer it and found a young woman standing there, shivering and visibly distressed. She claimed her car had broken down on a nearby trail and asked if she could come in to warm up and call for help. Mark and Lisa, though wary, felt a sense of responsibility and allowed her inside. The woman introduced herself as Sarah and seemed genuinely grateful for their help. She warmed up by the fireplace, and after a while, she made a call on their landline. As Sarah talked on the phone, Mark and Lisa noticed something odd. She kept looking anxiously out the window and checking her watch. The conversation was hurried and filled with fragmented sentences about getting away and they're closing in. Suddenly, Sarah abruptly ended the call, saying she had to leave quickly. She gathered her things and rushed out into the night without another word. Mark and Lisa were left unsettled, but assumed she was in a hurry to get to a safer place. Later that night, as Mark and Lisa were about to go to bed, they heard strange noises coming from the surrounding woods. The sounds were like footsteps crunching through leaves and occasional shuffling. They were frightened but decided to stay in the cabin, hoping it was just wildlife. The next morning, they discovered an eerie message carved into the door of the cabin. It read, "Help me. They're coming." They were alarmed and decided to leave immediately. When they reached the nearest town and reported the incident, they learned that Sarah was a witness in a high-profile criminal case and had been in hiding from dangerous individuals. The local authorities explained that the message was likely a desperate plea from Sarah, who had been trying to evade her pursuers. Mark and Lisa realized they had unknowingly provided refuge to someone in serious danger, and the experience left them deeply shaken, forever wary of the potential dangers lurking in the remote wilderness. In the summer of 2004, Emily Carter was walking home from her evening shift at a diner in a small town in Michigan. The sun had set, and the streets were empty, except for a single hitchhiker standing by the side of the road. The hitchhiker was a middle-aged man with a worn-out appearance and a nervous demeanor. Emily, feeling a mix of curiosity and concern, approached the man and offered to call for help if he needed it. The man declined, but his eyes showed a desperate need for assistance. He explained he had been waiting for a ride for hours, and his phone had died. Emily, not wanting to leave him stranded, offered to let him use her phone to call someone. As they walked to a nearby phone booth, the man kept glancing around nervously. Once inside, Emily handed him her phone, and he made a call. The conversation was brief and seemed odd, filled with strange, disjointed sentences. He hung up quickly, looking even more anxious. Just as Emily was about to ask if he needed anything else, the man's demeanor changed abruptly. He started to mumble about the others and "they're coming for me." Emily felt uneasy and suggested they call the police if he was in trouble. The man suddenly grabbed the phone and fled into the night. Confused and worried, Emily decided to leave the phone booth and head home. As she walked, she heard a series of strange, eerie sounds behind her but saw nothing in the dark streets. She quickened her pace, feeling a cold chill. The next day, Emily learned from a local news report that the man she had encountered was a fugitive wanted for several crimes, including assault and robbery. The police had found his abandoned phone in the same area Emily had met him. It was rumored he had been on the run from a group of vigilantes seeking justice. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly avoided becoming a victim in a dangerous game of cat and mouse. In the early summer of 1997, Tom Evans was driving through the remote stretches of Idaho after a long day at work. The sun was setting, and Tom was eager to get home. As he drove along a quiet highway, he saw a man on the side of the road, waving his arms and looking desperate. The man, in his late 30s, seemed to be in distress. His clothes were torn, and he appeared to have been in some sort of altercation. Tom, concerned for the man's safety, pulled over and offered him a ride. The man introduced himself as Richard and explained that his car had broken down and he was trying to get help. As Richard got into the car, he mentioned that he had been on his way to a friend's house in a nearby town. Tom, feeling compassionate, agreed to take him there. Richard seemed grateful, but as they drove, he became increasingly anxious and kept glancing nervously out of the windows. After a while, Richard suddenly asked Tom to pull over at an isolated area off the main road. He said he needed to make a quick phone call. Tom was hesitant but complied, thinking it might be important. As Richard got out, he instructed Tom to stay put. Tom watched as Richard walked a few steps away and started talking on his phone. The conversation seemed intense and hurried. Tom's unease grew, and he decided to investigate. Tom cautiously approached Richard and overheard part of the conversation, realizing it was not a phone call but a call for help from a partner. Richard was actually a con artist who had been setting up a trap for unsuspecting drivers. He was coordinating with an accomplice who was waiting to rob or harm anyone who stopped. Realizing the danger, Tom quickly returned to his car and drove off, leaving Richard behind. As Tom sped away, he saw the shadowy figure of Richard's accomplice emerging from the woods, likely preparing to intercept the next unsuspecting driver. Shaken by the close call, Tom reported the incident to the local authorities. The police were able to apprehend Richard and his accomplice, who were indeed part of a criminal ring targeting travelers. Tom's quick thinking had saved him from becoming another victim of their scheme. In the fall of 2011, David Miller, an avid hiker, set out to explore a remote trail in the Appalachian Mountains. The trail was known for its rugged terrain and beautiful views, but was less traveled, adding to its allure. David had planned a day-long hike and packed all the essentials. As he ventured deeper into the woods, David noticed an unusual sight: a man standing alone at a trail junction. The man appeared disheveled and anxious. His name was Eric, and he told David he had been hiking but had become lost. He seemed very agitated and asked if David could help him find his way back. David, always willing to assist, agreed to guide Eric. As they walked, Eric's demeanor grew increasingly frantic. He kept looking over his shoulder and mentioned that he had seen strange figures following him. David, though skeptical, decided to stay alert and be cautious. Eric's directions were erratic, and he frequently insisted on taking less traveled paths. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon. David's sense of unease increased as Eric became more insistent that they needed to keep moving quickly to avoid being caught. Eric started telling disturbing stories about people who had disappeared in the woods, claiming that the forest was cursed. David tried to calm him and refocus their efforts on finding a safe way back. The strange stories and Eric's behavior were unsettling, but David was determined to get both of them out safely. At one point, Eric suddenly stopped and begged David to hide with him. He claimed that a group was closing in on them and that they had to stay hidden to avoid capture. David, though deeply unsettled, agreed to find a hiding spot. As they crouched behind a dense thicket, David heard distant voices and footsteps. The sounds were muffled and indistinct, but they were enough to make David's heart race. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded away. David decided they needed to leave the hiding spot and find their way back to the trailhead. When they finally reached the trailhead, David was relieved to see other hikers and the park ranger's vehicle. He reported the situation to the ranger, who took note of Eric's description and promised to follow up. The next day, David learned that Eric had been missing for a while and had a history of mental health issues. The park rangers were concerned about his well-being and launched a search but found no trace of him. David was left with an unsettling experience, feeling that he had narrowly avoided a dangerous encounter in the eerie depths of the forest. In the summer of 2016, Clare Jensen decided to spend a day hiking in the remote hills of northern Utah. She was looking forward to a peaceful day surrounded by nature, away from the noise of city life. The trail she chose was known for its scenic beauty and solitude. Around midday, as Claire reached a particularly isolated part of the trail, she saw a man approaching from the opposite direction. He was disheveled, wearing ragged clothes, and looked extremely worn out. His name was Richard, and he explained that he had been hiking for days and had lost his way. Richard's story was confusing. He mentioned that he had taken a wrong turn and had been wandering aimlessly ever since. Claire, feeling sympathetic, offered to help him find his way back. They continued along the trail together, but as they walked, Richard grew increasingly anxious. He frequently glanced over his shoulder and kept muttering about the others who were after him. Claire noticed that Richard was becoming more and more frantic. He talked about hearing footsteps and voices in the forest, though Claire heard nothing. His behavior became more erratic, and he started insisting that they needed to move faster to avoid being caught. The forest was dense, and the daylight was fading quickly. Richard urged Claire to take a less-used path that veered off from the main trail. Despite her misgivings, Claire followed him, hoping to help him find his way out. As they moved further off the beaten path, the forest grew darker and more ominous. Suddenly, Richard stopped and insisted they hide. He claimed they were being followed and that they needed to stay out of sight. Claire, now deeply unnerved, questioned his urgency and the strange circumstances but decided to comply, hiding with him behind a large fallen tree. From their hiding spot, they saw figures moving through the forest. They were shadowy and indistinct, but their presence was undeniable. Claire's heart raced as Richard's behavior became increasingly panicked. He whispered that these were the people he had been running from, and they would catch up to them if they weren't careful. Eventually, Claire decided she could no longer stay hidden. She told Richard they needed to get back to the main trail. As they retraced their steps, the figures seemed to follow them, though Claire never saw them clearly. By the time they reached the trailhead, it was dark, and Claire felt a profound sense of relief. She quickly made her way back to civilization and reported the incident to the park rangers. They investigated but found no trace of the figures Richard had described. Claire later learned that Richard had a history of mental health issues and had been reported missing by his family. The park rangers suspected he had been suffering from a severe episode, and the figures might have been hallucinations. The experience left Claire shaken, and she was left with the haunting feeling that she had narrowly escaped a potentially dangerous situation.